Epoxy projects can be intimidating and expensive if you screw up. Trust me, I've done plenty of that in the past. And you don't need all of this just to make beautiful projects. In this video, I'm gonna show you all the tips and tricks I've learned over my years of screwing up so you can make beautiful epoxy projects at home. So the first thing to mastering your epoxy project is going to be choosing the right epoxy. That was a drum roll, by the way. So there's tons of options out there. Most commonly what you're gonna be seeing is it's called tabletop epoxy. And I've made the mistake in the past where I've taken tabletop epoxy and I tried to fill voids with it, and then I watch it crystallize, crack, break, and ruin the project. Don't do that. What you wanna do is make sure that when you are purchasing epoxy, you're researching the depth of pour and what its suggested uses are for. You can't just buy anything and use it. Specifics of tabletop epoxy is it's for exactly that, just the top. There's tons of options out there for it. You wanna make sure you're reading the label when it's on the shelf before you buy it, and then using it in the suggested application. When you get into the pours, you're going to be using more of the type of epoxy you see here. This is the liquid plastic from Ecopoxy. This is their, what's it called? SureCast, FlowCast. This is for their super deep pours, but they still have like super specific types of usage that is distinctly labeled directly on the bottles. So check it out. This liquid glass product specifically says for pours up to 2 inches. This casting resin is for specifically pours above 1 inch. The liquid plastic I've used on the Black Rifle and on the River Table are used for pours up to 2 inches as well. That stuff is so important when it comes to making any sort of resin project that if you overlook it in the beginning, you're really gonna pay for it on the back end. Now that doesn't mean you can't do multiple pours of super thin epoxy and layer that up and it won't be clear. It's just not gonna be the same effect as some of these. These are all slow setting epoxies. They do cost a considerable amount more and they take forever to dry. Like the Black Rifle coffee table took 5 days to dry. It was ridiculous. But because of that slow release, that's what let all of the bubbles come out of all of the bullet casings and why we were able to get it to look crystal clear. Then we have more of like your standard usage type epoxies. These are still gonna have extremely specific directions on the labels. I've been using West Systems and Totalboat for years. And you have your standard slow hardener and your fast hardener. See, it says right here, fast hardener. It hardens in like 2 hours, but because of that, it's not gonna allow as much air to release and you can't pour it as thick. It has limitations on the volume you're suggested to use. And all of that is laid out on the labels. The point of this segment is to read the label. There's multiple options out there and you wanna make sure you're choosing the right epoxy for your application. The last type of epoxy we use commonly is 5-minute epoxy or 15-minute epoxy. You can get this stuff. It's great for quick fixes. It's not really applicable in epoxy projects that you're gonna be making something with. It's just if you wanna stick 2 things together or you need to fill a hole, a bug hole, something like that. It's a really cool, usable product, but you definitely don't wanna be pouring or trying to do anything deep with it as well. The one thing we've overlooked the most often in any sort of resin project is the temperature of the shop. This is so important that like we need to put a sign when doing resin on the wall that makes us turn the damn heater on. And because of that, the epoxy doesn't set and it sets improperly. So if you look at like, which one we used most recently? Here. Right on the front, it says for temperatures of, I think it says 77? Recommended storage is 59 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's freedom units. 68 to 77 degrees freedom unit for working temperature. This is huge because if it's too cold in your shop, the resin won't cure. It needs heat in order for the chemical reaction to make it do its thing. And it's just something that I've overlooked on literally every single resin project we've done. And it's bit me on the back end as far as time of drying or the clarity of the pour. You just wanna make sure beforehand that your shop's set to the proper temperature. Trust me on this one. So tip number 2 is going to be building a proper form. This has been a nightmare for me in the past because I underestimated how important it was. So the first thing you're gonna wanna do is make sure you're choosing the right material. A lot of people are using melamine for their forms, and that's absolutely fantastic. Just understand on deeper pours that the heat generated by the epoxy itself can melt the melamine, and it can melt into your project. Something else we like to use is MDF, only because it's an extremely flat and affordable substrate, because most of the time your forms are going to be thrown away. So if you're using either one of these, what you want to make sure you're definitely doing to your form is pre-sealing it with some type of tape. Your two best options are going to be a Tyvek, it's Tyvek, right, Sam? Tyvek tape, which is like a roofing and sheathing tape for exteriors and homes and stuff, or just your standard packing tape. What happens is that creates a release with the resin, and it makes it so much easier to take apart. It also doesn't bond to whatever that surface is. There's also an option out there to use PVC sheeting. That's super expensive stuff, but you can definitely make reusable molds. Phenomenal product. We just don't choose to use it here because we don't do like enough epoxy pouring to store those molds. So we just make these like kind of disposable. But with that, you want to be sure you're building your mold oversized. It's happened to us a ton, is that we've built our mold exactly to the size of the table or whatever we're building, and we've had to cut that down after and lose a few inches on all the sides because you're not gonna get a perfect edge out of the form. So next thing you wanna do, considering the edges of your form, is choose how you're gonna put them together. We suggest using countersunk screws in order to do so. That way you can take the mold apart easily. We pin some of ours together with brad nails, and that takes a little bit more effort and also destroys the form when you're taking it apart. But if you do it with screws, you can get a couple uses out of it, probably 2, 3 max, before those screw holes aren't gonna hold up when you're putting a form together. You'll see some of the guys in Canada, the pros, the big guys, the ones that are doing it a ton, are using screws to put their molds together, but they're also using biscuits for alignment. And then they also use caulking. We like to use black caulking in our projects so you can see it. If I'm putting something on a white sheet or whatever, I've got this Tyvek tape all over it, and I use a clear caulking, I can't see it. I don't know where it's at, and that way I can't clean it up. So what we like to do is wax the corners of the mold and then put the caulking in. And then that way, where we take this little fondant tool from a tip we stole from our buddy Mike Clifford, you press it into the corner, and that way it squishes the caulking out that isn't in your actual seam, giving you a nice smooth line there, and then you can just peel it away, the part that you waxed. And that also helps with the release of the resin. You definitely want to make sure that you're using caulking in your corners. We also like to put caulking in the bottom of our table if we're doing a river. What that does is it keeps anything that gets underneath your slabs from seeping all around the bottom there, because that is definitely something that can happen. Ooh, and another tip when you're building your form is to make sure that you're compensating for floating within your form. So if you're building a box around a slab, you want to make sure that you have the ability to hold that slab down. We'll run screws from underneath sometimes to make sure we're holding things down if it's a huge table, or you can use blocks on the top and clamps from the outside to make sure whatever you're putting in that resin isn't floating. We use a mixer on a drill to make sure our stuff is thoroughly mixed. It's just really easy and convenient. You don't have to stand there and stir with your hand. And you want to keep this thing as clean as possible. For our clear pours, we use a brand new one because you don't want to get anything in there. But if you're introducing pigment, which would be what you're doing right now at this time of your pouring experience, you want to make sure that you can reuse your mixer, because it's not gonna matter if you get like a little speck of dirt or dust in it. You're not gonna really see it unless you're doing something translucent. So speaking of pigment, there's gonna be two different types. You're gonna have your liquid pigment and you're gonna have your powdered pigment. We prefer powder pigment just because it's easier to control. In my experience, the volumes, you can use a little scooper, you can use a tablespoon, a teaspoon, whatever you want, however you want to try to do that to make sure you're measuring consistently across your pours. It's just easier to do that with a powdered pigment. Plus, when you're doing smaller pours, if you're introducing another liquid into the chemistry of what you're pouring, if you put too much in, it can affect the hardness to an extent. In my experience, there's been a few times where I've just put too much liquid pigment in and it didn't harden in the time frame I was looking for it to harden in. So I just leaned towards the
sort of the powdered pigments. And there's a bunch of great companies that make this kind of stuff. We like Black Diamond pigments, and then Ecopoxy carries their own line of pigments as well. Last thing you're gonna make sure you have on hand for the pour is some nitrile gloves. You don't want to get this stuff on your hands because basically the only way to clean it off is with acetone, and acetone is not good for your skin. Plus you can develop allergies and there's all kinds of stuff. So keep a bunch of gloves around, and I would highly suggest covering your work surface with plastic too. If you're gonna be doing on a workbench, you're not building a mold that's gonna be somewhere else. But before you pour, you want to 100% make sure that your form is level. Looking back on our large 60 liter, was that 60 liters? Yes, the resin river table we did, the blue one, we made sure like 20 times over that every part of that form was level because this stuff it's not viscous. It is literally as thin as water when you're getting with the deep pour resins, and it'll go everywhere. Like if it starts running, you're screwed. Like you cannot stop it. And we've run into that in the past, and it is a nightmare. It is literally a nightmare. You want an automatic trigger, you don't want to have to get a striker out in order to turn it on, because what happens is bubbles start popping up everywhere, and you want to hit those as fast as possible. You can also use a good heat gun, not an electrician's heat gun, but like a painter's heat gun. The difference is the amount of heat, but the heat will help you control bubbles. And then some brands suggest vibration, some don't. That's gonna be brand specific. We're not gonna get into that in this video, but we definitely keep a torch on hand to make sure that we're dispersing of the bubbles as fast as possible, as well as if it gets onto a plastic or certain metal surfaces and stuff, you can heat up the resin, pry it off with a putty knife. So now that your form is level, you're gonna wanna vacuum the form out. It is imperative that you vacuum and clean out your form. Dust, debris, all of us are working in a shop or somewhere that's not as it's not as sterile as a hospital. So you wanna keep that form as squeaky clean as absolutely possible. Compressed air and a vacuum are gonna be your best friends in these situations. And also considering vacuums, if you're pouring certain types of epoxy and they're not slow setting, you can still use a resin that pours up to say 1/4 or 1/2 inch thick. In order to relieve the bubbles, you wanna consider using a vacuum pot or a pressure pot. It's a pressure pot, right? Yeah, we think it's a pressure pot. But you've seen some of the wizards out there, like Paul Jackman. He's always using a pressure pot for his resin because he's pouring the weirdest things ever, and it's not typically a deep pour, and it helps relieve all those bubbles, and he's had extreme success doing wild stuff with resin. So surface prep for epoxy projects is an interesting subject. First thing you're gonna wanna make sure you do after your project comes out of the mold is get it flattened. There's multiple ways to do this. You can use a router jig to flatten things. If you remember, I did a 5-minute router jig video with Mike Montgomery when I was out at the Maker Ranch, and that's super easy. You could take that kind of method and go about flattening it. You could use your CNC, which is what we did on the massive river table we poured recently, or we used our woodpecker's flattening jig on the black rifle table. But it is imperative that you flatten your piece because you can't run it through a planer. And unless you have a wide belt sander, which most of us don't, you're not gonna be able to get those surfaces parallel and make a proper piece of furniture or table, whatever you're trying to make with your resin project. From there, you're gonna wanna go through your standard sanding process that you would do on any woodworking project. For us, we really like using these Abernet style sanding discs while we're working with resin, being that they're porous and they have a lot more area for your dust extraction to come through. They don't get as gummed up, and you don't run through as much paper as you would. Mirka makes these, as well as Diablo has options too that you can pick up at your home store that are both really good for epoxy resin projects. I would suggest going that route. I typically start working from 80 grit and up, so we go 80, 120, 220, 320, 400. On all of our resin projects. We're trying to get as much sheen as we can onto the resin, not necessarily throughout all of the wood. What you're trying to do is eliminate scratches and swirls in your top coat finish before you go and apply your finish. If you're going for crystal clear resin, which is a large amount of the questions I got on the black rifle table, the next aspect of that is going to come into buffing. So a few things you're gonna wanna get into. Can it still see me? Is we use polish from the automotive store. You're gonna have different cuts This specific brand says the cut right on the front. You got your light cut all the way up to heavy. This is what detailers use to polish cars. If you're going from, say, a 220, 320-ish sanding grit, you're gonna wanna use a heavy cut first, and then just follow the directions on the bottle in order to apply it and then remove it. Super easy. You can also substitute polishing with this stuff with wet sanding if you want to get into that and if you have the proper kind of tools to do so. We did that on the Black Rifle table, worked out great. If you're going to be using one of these rubs, you need to make sure that you remove it from the surface before you go to clear coat. But in order to get it to be as close to as clear and see-through as possible, you definitely want to make sure you're polishing and buffing that up. You can snag up one of these buffers for like 40 bucks at Harbor Freight. They work great. They're for car detailing. They don't have like the best cord length. I mean, you're going to need an extension cord. But I've used this thing a ton. I've got a little bit of a bigger one too that I've used a bunch. Both of those are awesome. Get yourself some bonnets for them. And then make sure that your just surface is as absolutely scratch-free as possible before you get into finish.
So the last part to creating a phenomenal epoxy project is going to be the finish. You've got it prepped, poured, sanded, and this is the last part, but almost the most important part. There is thousands of options out there for finish. We prefer just a couple, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't try the others. So my favorite low VOC and hand applied finish is always going to be Rubio Monocoat. You've seen this on a lot of my projects. Super easy application, and it has this accelerator too. But you can just use the oil, and it's a oil and waxed based finish that you can apply by hand. Why is this one phenomenal and great and should you be considering is because if you don't have a spray booth or a sprayer, you're gonna wanna use something that doesn't let off a ton of fumes, that is easy to fix. That's also gonna give you that sheen. So Rubio Monocoat Pure, check it out. It's a phenomenal option for any type of epoxy project. There's also a great competitive product that's called Osmo. The Canadians love it. I've never used it, but I've heard it's actually really, really good. It's very, very similar to the kind of application you'd use Rubio on. It's more similar to this Odie's oil, which was something that I was seeing a lot of people using in the past. Another great product, but these are all essentially a oil and wax based sort of basic finish. And these all go on and then you buff them up to sheen. Really, really easy to apply, whether you have a massive shop or you're doing something like this in your basement. Now, if you want to get into the more complex kind of finishes, we like and prefer using a 2-part catalyzed lacquer. We pick ours up at the local Sherwin-Williams. There's a bunch of companies that make this. I would call around to your like professional finish shops, places, professional finish places, paint shops, paint stores. Benjamin Moore, we have here on the East Coast, DSI is a company. They carry, no, I didn't just fart. I can't remember the name of the company, but they carry 2-part catalyzed lacquer. The stuff you buy off the shelf is pre-catalyzed lacquer. This is catalyzed on site before we bring it into the shop, and it has a pot life of about 6 months. Dries in about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we sand to 320 grit, we sand at 320 grit between coats. After this gets sprayed on, we let it off gas for 2 to 3 days, and then come back with a wax and buff that to sheen. Works really, really well. It is an extremely versatile finish. It also takes a ton of abuse, but it's one of those finishes where like if you don't use a coaster, you're gonna get a ring. If you screw it up, you're gonna have to call someone to kind of fix it. It blushes. It's not the best finish. It's just a really, really easy, and it's basically what like your cabinets are finished with. You can also probably use a 2-part varnish. A lot of pros love that kind of finish too, but this stuff's great. We're big fans. Check it out if you're looking to spray a finish. And then lastly is going to be the tabletop epoxy. Now, a lot of people are like, John, I use the deep pour. Why do I need to use a tabletop? The classic tabletop epoxy concept works really, really well on river tables and
in epoxy projects, because what it's going to do is bond with the resin, and it's going to eliminate like the scratch marks and create reflection inside of it and really bring it up to a shine. Just follow the directions on it. I don't use it because it's typically going to be a glossy or a very, very shiny finish. And that's not normally what I'm looking for in my projects, but it's a great option, and you can buy these off the shelf at all the box stores as well as from any of the brands that are making your deep pour epoxies as well.
And that's gonna be a wrap on this one. Appreciate you guys tuning in. If you have any questions about anything that I covered here, leave them down in the description. And if not, then I'll catch you on one of my resin project builds.